There is a city that, for centuries, laughed in the face of every army that tried to take it. Not because it had more soldiers, not because its walls were the tallest in the ancient world, but because it was built on a ridge so steep, so surrounded by valleys on all four sides, that its defenders went as far as telling the advancing army, "Even the blind and the lame will be enough to drive you back." As we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 6, that was the Jebusites' answer when David marched against Jerusalem. Think about what that means tactically. It wasn't empty arrogance. It was a cold, precise military assessment. The city was positioned in such a way that every natural approach created kill corridors for any attacking force. The walls rising over that ridge made a direct assault an exercise in organized self-destruction. And worst of all for David, he didn't have the massive siege equipment the great empires used to reduce fortresses. The Israelites of that period were still learning the art of siege warfare. The Jebusites knew it. And yet, David took the city. How long does the Bible say the assault took? Not months. The narrative in 2 Samuel 5 moves from the Jebusite taunt to the fall of the fortress in a matter of verses. This was no drawn-out siege. It was a surgical strike, a penetration tactic so unexpected that the defenders couldn't respond in time. But before stepping into the heart of that maneuver, we need to understand who the men on that battlefield were, and why that specific city was worth risking everything. David didn't arrive at Jerusalem as an inexperienced king. He arrived as someone who had spent years being hunted through mountains and deserts, commanding a company of feudal mercenaries on rapid strike missions, learning guerrilla warfare firsthand, as prey and as predator. As we read in 1 Samuel chapter 30, David's campaign against the Amalekites, who had raided Ziklag, demonstrated his capacity for rapid movement, immediate decision-making, and full exploitation of victory. That repertoire reached far beyond what any conventional general of the period possessed. Joab, son of Zeruiah, was his field commander, a man of brutal action and cold efficiency. 2 Samuel 2 and 1 Chronicles 11 record Joab not as a decorative figure, but as the executing arm of David's tactical vision. He was the one who went in first where no one else wanted to go. He was the one who paid the physical price for the king's strategic decisions. On the other side of the walls stood the Jebusites, a small ethnic community, without strong alliances among the surrounding Canaanite peoples, without particular regional sympathy. But they had built in Jerusalem something that compensated for all of those deficits, a defensive position that challenged every assault manual of the ancient world. Their warriors knew every angle of every wall. They knew where the valleys created death zones for attackers. They knew time was on their side. And here is the paradox that opens everything. The tactic that will decide this battle won't be a taller ladder, more soldiers, or a longer siege. It will be the discovery that the city's own survival infrastructure, the very system that kept it alive during sieges, was also its Achilles heel. Why did Jerusalem matter so much to David that he would risk everything on this assault? The answer is written in the geography itself. The city sat at the exact center of the Cisjordanian highland massif. It controlled the crossroads of the main routes linking the Mediterranean to Transjordan. The road from Jaffa to Rabbath Ammon passed through there. The north-south ridge road of the western highlands passed through there. Whoever controlled Jerusalem controlled the flow of people, commerce, and military forces across the entire region. And beyond that, and this was politically crucial, Jerusalem had no tribal affiliation with any of the tribes of Israel. By choosing it as his capital, David wasn't favoring Judah, Benjamin, or any other clan. It was neutral ground, a unifying anchor for a kingdom still bleeding from the internal divisions of Saul's era. The city's climate was mild. Its cisterns collected enough rainwater to sustain the population for an entire year without outside sources, a fact that would be confirmed repeatedly over the following centuries every time the city came under siege. There was a perennial spring at the foot of the ridge, accessible through a covered passage even during sieges. That spring, that covered passage, that water. This is exactly where David's tactic will find its opening. To understand why David's assault on Jerusalem was a brilliant tactical solution, you first need to understand the full scope of the problem, and the instruments of war both sides held in their hands. The Jebusites were not a primitive people huddled behind improvised walls. They were experienced defenders of a fortress that had withstood centuries of military pressure. Their walls followed the contour of the ridge, using the topography as the first line of defense. The citadel, the most protected core, the northern end of the elongated ridge, was the highest point and the most difficult to approach. That's where the Jebusites concentrated their elite garrison. The defenders' arsenal included the composite bow, one of the most sophisticated weapons of the period, built in layers of horn, wood, and sinew, capable of firing arrows with force and accuracy at distances simple bows couldn't reach. On the walls and towers, Jebusite archers held the advantage of height, angle, and cover. Any attacking force trying to climb the slopes would be exposed to that downward fire for long, agonizing minutes of slow ascent. Beyond the bows, the defenders carried wooden spears tipped with iron and bronze. Spears hurled from elevated positions multiplied in reach and impact. The shields protecting archers at the embrasures were large, made of hardened leather over wooden frames, fixed to the walls while the warrior fired. There were also slingers, soldiers who specialized in the sling, capable of launching stones with devastating precision from protected positions in the towers. The sling, in the ancient Near East, was no peasant's weapon. It was an instrument of precision in trained hands, capable of dropping an armored man at 50 meters. The walls themselves functioned as a weapon. Projecting towers jutted out from the perimeter, creating firing angles that covered the flanks of assault groups. There was no blind spot along the wall curtains. Any soldier reaching the base of the wall was exposed to lateral fire from the neighboring towers. Defenders on the walls could also drop stones, timber, and other projectiles directly onto attackers trying to approach with ladders. And there was still another factor that weighed most heavily against David at that moment: the invocation of the blind and the lame as the city's guardians. The Bible records this in 2 Samuel 5 verse 6, and the text is not recording a joke. In the mental world of the ancient Near East, the summoning of figures associated with curses and spells was a form of psychological warfare with real effect on troops. When the Jebusites declared that the blind and the lame would defend the city, they were, according to the understanding of the period, casting a curse over the attackers. The Bible records that the Israelites held back from advancing, which confirms that the psychological blow initially worked. On the Israelite side, David's army of that period combined different tribal specialties he had learned to coordinate over years of independent command. The Benjaminites were ambidextrous archers, trained to fire with both the left and the right hand. 1 Chronicles 12, verse 2 records that specialty with precision. The Gadites were shield and spear bearers, with the agility of mountain gazelles, according to 1 Chronicles 12, verse 9. The sons of Judah carried shield and heavy spear, forming the backbone of the shock infantry. The Issacharites were recognized as the best in reconnaissance missions and tactical reading of the terrain. The Israelite infantry divided into light troops, archers, slingers, and dart throwers, and heavy troops, the armored spearmen of Judah, who formed the mass of infantry capable of absorbing the initial shock and driving the enemy back. The short iron sword, still relatively new as the dominant material in that transitional period from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, was the quintessential close combat weapon. The Israelites didn't yet rely on war chariots the way the Philistines and Canaanites did. Their strength lay in their feet, their legs, and their adaptability to the rugged terrain of the Judean highlands. And it was precisely that tradition of combat on broken ground that would prepare Joab for what was about to happen. David assessed the situation. A frontal assault on the walls would produce enormous losses before the troops even reached the base of the stones. A prolonged siege would consume resources he didn't yet have in stable supply. The kingdom had just been unified. The northern tribes were still absorbing his leadership, and the Philistines were watching every move. Every week in front of Jerusalem was a week of strategic vulnerability on the frontiers. That's when David's eye landed on the Tzinor. As we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 8, David said that day, "Whoever strikes the Jebusites, let him go up through the water shaft." The Hebrew word Tzinor is translated in various ways: channel, aqueduct, shaft, passage. What it designates is the underground passage carved through the living rock, descending the eastern slope of the ridge, passing beneath the wall, and reaching the Gihon Spring, the perennial spring at the foot of the hill. It was the water supply system that guaranteed the city's survival during sieges. And at that moment, it was also a tunnel that led from the outside directly into the interior of the Jebusite defenses. David's maneuver would work on two simultaneous layers, one visible, one invisible. The visible layer was the demonstration attack on the northern sector of the citadel, where the Jebusites expected the main assault, where they had concentrated their best archers and throwers. While attention was locked on that front, waiting for the Israelite shock that would never arrive in decisive form, Joab and a chosen group of men would enter through the Tzinor. The invisible layer was the bet on reaction speed. Once Joab emerged from the interior of the water supply system inside the walls, the window of time before the Jebusites could reorganize their defense would be minimal. They had to move before panic converted into ordered resistance. To persuade someone to go first into a vertical shaft in the dark, knowing the enemy was somewhere above, David did something the Bible records with clinical precision in 1 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 6. "Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander." The prize wasn't gold. It was leadership. It was rank. It was the permanent acknowledgement that this man had gone in first where no one else was willing to go. Joab went in. There is a difference between knowing a tactic will work and being the man who has to execute it with his own body. Joab, son of Zeruiah, understood both sides of that equation and chose the second role. The Tzinor, identified by modern archaeologists with what became known as Warren's Shaft, named after General Sir Charles Warren, who explored it in the 19th century, was not a wide, comfortable passage. It was a fissure cut through living rock, narrow, damp, and dark, descending the slope of the ridge to a vertical shaft 15 meters high, between the tunnel coming from the city and the channel leading to the waters of the spring. Kathleen Kenyon, one of the great archaeologists who studied Jerusalem in the 20th century, repeatedly drew attention to the extreme physical conditions Joab and his men faced inside that passage. 15 meters of vertical shaft, in total darkness, carrying weapons, not knowing how many Jebusites were waiting at the top. That detail is not incidental to the battle's script. It is the heart of the tactic. Because the only reason the Jebusites hadn't closed off that vulnerability was precisely the fact that it seemed unthinkable as a vector of attack. No ancient general would send his men through a water supply system to take a fortress. It was physically exhausting, tactically dangerous, and psychologically harrowing. It was exactly because it was unthinkable that it worked. Ancient military history records this pattern repeatedly, not in David's battles specifically, but in the underlying principle. Secret passages that secure a fortress's supply tend to be inadequately guarded precisely because they represent the proverbial point that no one imagines anyone will use as an entry. The defender's attention is always on the walls, the gates, the obvious approaches. The invisible flank is the water point. While Joab climbed that shaft, stone by stone, arms burning with effort, hearing the muffled noise of the demonstration battle outside, something was happening on the surface that made that climb possible. The Jebusites' attention was fixed on the northern sector, where Israelite pressure was simulating an assault that would never reach its decisive phase. The defenders on the walls were positioned for the attack they knew, for the enemy they could see, not for the enemy emerging from within. When Joab and his men came out of the Tzinor, the surprise was, by the tactical analysis of the context, nearly total. The text in 1 Chronicles 11 records that Joab became chief, which confirms he fulfilled the condition David had established. He struck the Jebusites from within, secured a position near that access point, and held it while reinforcements came through the same passage. What happens next is the difference between a well-executed infiltration and an actual victory. Joab couldn't simply appear inside the city with a handful of men and wait for the Jebusites to collapse. The moment of disorientation had to be exploited before the defenders could reorganize. 2 Samuel 5 verse 7 records that David took the fortress of Zion, the most protected core of the city, the very thing the Jebusites had considered impregnable. That was only possible because Joab's action had created a breach point inside the walls at the exact moment when enemy attention was divided and panic hadn't yet hardened into ordered resistance. There is a tactical lesson here that reaches beyond military engineering. It speaks to the relationship between the enemy's moment of vulnerability and the capacity to exploit that moment before it closes. Every fortress has a window of time in which internal chaos overrides its defensive superiority. David's tactic was designed to open that window, and Joab was the instrument that passed through it. If this kind of analysis of biblical warfare resonates with you, if the way the Lord guides every detail of a battle before the first step is ever taken fascinates you, this is exactly what we'll keep exploring together. Every battle in the Bible carries a tactical layer that most readings simply never reach. Now, when does this tactic fail? The Philistines themselves will give the answer. Shortly after the fall of Jerusalem, as we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verses 17 through 25, the Philistines responded to David's coronation as king over all Israel with 2 incursions into the valley of Rephaim. Here, the tactical situation was completely different. There was no fortress to penetrate. There was an open-field army, equipped with war chariots, the dominant shock weapon of the Philistine plains, advancing through the valley. The Philistine war chariots were the ancient equivalent of light armored vehicles, crewed by 2 or 3 men, a driver and 1 or 2 warriors armed with bow and spear. They were mobile platforms that launched projectiles in motion and created devastating psychological impact on infantry that didn't know how to respond. The Philistine force of that period also included heavy infantry with their distinctive violin-shaped shields, long spears, and iron swords, a material the Israelites themselves still struggled to obtain, as recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 13. The Philistines had maintained for some time a virtual monopoly on ironworking in the region, which meant their warriors entered combat with weapons superior in durability and cutting edge. In the first battle of the Valley of Rephaim, David didn't use the Tzinor. There was no Tzinor to use. Instead, he consulted the Lord, as we read in 2 Samuel 5 verse 19, and received the answer, attack. David flanked the Philistines, ambushed them at Baal-perazim, and defeated them on the flank as they advanced through the valley. The valley terrain with its abrupt slopes was familiar to Israeli infantry and a nightmare for chariot mobility. David let the Philistines penetrate deep into the Judean highlands before closing the trap. In the second incursion, the tactic had to change completely. And here God's instruction reveals a tactical sophistication that goes beyond human calculation. As we read in 2 Samuel 5 verse 23, the Lord does not repeat the previous command. Do not attack them from the front. Instead, circle around behind them and ambush them in front of the balsam trees. When you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the trees, move quickly. That will be the signal that the Lord has gone out ahead of you to strike the Philistine army. Same geography, entirely different tactic. The auditory signal from the trees, likely the wind creating a cover of sound, marked the precise moment for attack. Not before, not after. Timing as the decisive weapon. What that sequence of battles reveals is exactly where the Tzinor infiltration would not have worked. In open field, against a force mounted on chariots, underground penetration is irrelevant. The right tactic shifts completely depending on the theater of operations. David understood that, and every time he consulted the Lord before engaging, he received not a repeated formula, but a specific instruction for that moment and that enemy. That is what separates a general from a warrior. The warrior applies what he knows. The general reads what is in front of him. We've arrived at what the Bible considers the most important point of everything we've just analyzed. Not the engineering of the Tzinor, not David's brilliance in dividing the defender's attention, not Joab's physical courage climbing 15 meters in the dark. All of that was real. All of it was tactical. All of it happened. But the biblical text places a foundation beneath all of that human architecture that changes the weight of everything. As we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5 verse 10, "And David grew stronger and stronger, for the Lord God of hosts was with him." In 1 Chronicles chapter 11 verse 9, the formula repeats with the same precision. "And David became greater and greater, for the Lord of hosts was with him." The Bible does not attribute the fall of Jerusalem solely to David's tactical intelligence. It draws a direct line between the Lord's presence and the outcome of the battle. This is not decorative language. In the biblical world, that statement carries operational weight. The God who had promised Jerusalem as the capital of a unified Israel was opening the way where the way seemed closed. Think about what that means within the sequence of events. David saw the Tzinor. That was human observation, field intelligence. David decided to use it. That was strategic courage. David offered command to the first man who entered. That was leadership. Joab went in. That was physical courage. The city fell. But the Bible doesn't conclude by saying, "And so the intelligent king took the city." It concludes by saying, "The Lord was with David." The tactic was the arm. The divine presence was the force that moved the arm. This pattern isn't a literary accident. It appears before every decisive battle in David's career. Before Baal-perazim, the text records explicitly, "David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I attack the Philistines?' The Lord answered, 'Go, I will help you defeat them.'" Before the second battle of the Valley of Rephaim, once again David inquired of the Lord. That inquiry wasn't religious protocol. It was the recognition that human intelligence, however sharp, operates within a battlefield it cannot fully see. David saw the terrain. God saw the whole. And there is a specific dimension of the battle for Jerusalem that confirms this in a way that goes beyond pure tactics. The Jebusite curse, the invocation of the blind and the lame, had stalled the Israelite advance. The text indicates that David's warriors held back from continuing the assault after that declaration. Supernatural fear had created a real block on the troops. David's response wasn't a motivational speech. It was finding the Tzinor, a path that bypassed not just the physical walls, but the very point of psychological pressure. The attack through the inner channel didn't confront the blind and the lame. It didn't need to. It arrived from the inside, before the curse had anywhere to land. It is as if the divine instruction, implicit in the narrative, visible in the sequence of events, had pointed David to the exact spot where the enemy's defense was most blind to its own vulnerability. What happens after the fall of the city confirms the strategic and spiritual significance of what just occurred. 2 Samuel 5, verse 11, records that Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David bearing cedar logs, carpenters, and stonemasons to build him a palace. A Phoenician king, experienced in the power plays of the region, recognized in David not merely a general who had taken a city, but a ruler whose position was consolidating with a speed that demanded immediate diplomatic respect. And David interpreted that with theological precision. The text records that David knew that the Lord had established him as king over Israel and had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. The confirmation came from outside, from a foreign king under no obligation to acknowledge Israelite sovereignty. And David read it correctly, as divine confirmation, not personal conquest. Here is something that purely military analysis of the conquest of Jerusalem tends to miss. The choice of the city as capital was not just geopolitical strategy. Jerusalem's tribal neutrality, the fact that it belonged to none of the tribes of Israel, made it the only point capable of unifying a kingdom that had spent years torn between loyalty to Saul, rooted in the north, and loyalty to David, grounded in Judah. By taking Jerusalem rather than a tribal city, David was building a national identity that transcended tribal identity. That was politics. That was sociology. And it was also, according to the biblical text, the fulfillment of a promise that preceded David himself. The strategic concept that crystallizes across David's conquests reaches far beyond Jerusalem. He was the first ruler of the region to grasp that sustainable control of the Palestinian land bridge required command of the three main routes linking Egypt to Asia Minor and Mesopotamia: the Via Maris along the coast, the watershed road through the Central Highlands, and the King's Highway across Transjordan. Jerusalem was the central node of all three routes. Whoever controlled it controlled the entire regional chessboard. That's why the wars that followed, against the Philistines on the coastal plains, against Moab east of the Jordan, against the Edomites in the Valley of Salt south of the Dead Sea, against the Arameans on the northern frontier, were not wars of random expansion. Each one sealed a point of vulnerability on the perimeter of that triangle of control. Each one was the logical continuation of what began with the taking of Jerusalem. And the Bible evaluates each of those campaigns by the same criterion it used to evaluate the fall of the Jebusite city. Not by the number of soldiers, not by the quality of the weapons, not by the ingenuity of the tactics, but by the presence or absence of the Lord in David's initiative. When David consulted the Lord before going into battle, he won. When he acted on his own, as the episode with Bathsheba and its consequences for Uriah, recorded in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, makes clear, the biblical narrative shows the consequences of a man who tried to apply the same tactical intelligence that had taken Jerusalem to a moral situation where it had no application. This is what the Bible calls the heart. Samuel had anointed David because the Lord did not judge as men judge, by appearance or stature, but saw the heart. 1 Samuel 16, verse 7. David's heart was what made him fit not for a battle, but for a reign. And when that heart became divided, the reign bled too. David's tactical legacy is not a list of maneuvers. It is the demonstration, battle by battle, that military intelligence and dependence on God are not forces that cancel each other. They are forces that multiply when they operate together. The general who saw the Tzinor where no one else saw it, who read the Jebusite curse and found a path around it, who knew when to attack head-on and when to circle through the balsam trees, was the same man who stopped before every battle and asked, "What does God say?" That question was the most sophisticated tactic in the entire collection. Picture that final scene now. Joab emerging from the Tzinor inside the walls of Jerusalem. Panic spreading among defenders who heard the sounds of close combat rising from within the city, from a point no defensive plan had ever considered. Attention divided, the north threatened, the interior breached, and somewhere out there, on the steep slope of the ridge, David waiting for the signal that the impossible point had given way. The city of David was not taken in spite of the Jebusite walls. It was taken through them, by the only passage those walls had built for their own survival. As we read in 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 12, the Lord confirmed David's kingship over Israel and exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. The most impregnable fortress in the ancient world held out precisely until the right man found the point nobody was guarding.